A social distancing tip.
Keeping your distance from others is important in slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are some fun things to do alone. Read a book, take a walk, unpack your suitcase from that trip you took last September, paint a self-portrait, catch up on a TV series, do a puzzle. Remember, we should all stay home to lower the risk for everyone. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #alone together. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
I rise in support of H.R. 4104, the Negro Leagues Baseball Centennial Commemorative Coin Act. In New Jersey's 2nd District, we were home to the Bacharach Giants in Atlantic City. The team was a top contender in the league and won 2 pennants in 1926 and 1927. The Giants were lucky enough to host players such as John Henry Pop Lloyd, a player who Babe Ruth himself once called the greatest ball player of all time, anywhere, ever. Pop Lloyd would end up retiring and coaching youth baseball in Atlantic City until the day he died. And he was inducted into the Baseball Hall of Fame in 1977. Players like Pop Lloyd would lay the foundation for future stars such as Jackie Robinson and Hank Aaron, who would change the game forever. Yet players like Lloyd and the leagues they played in are slowly becoming forgotten to the annals of history. We cannot let that happen. I thank the gentleman from Missouri for introducing this important legislation to commemorate and honor those players and the role they play in shaping America's very favorite pastime. May God bless them. Thank you, and I yield back.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hello, gang. It's your professor of previously domiciled, your reverend of relocation, your captain of contraction, your evocator of expansion, your doctor of defunct. It's your pal, Tim Hanlon. And it is, of course, Good Seats Still Available, the curious little podcast, not so little anymore, actually, that is devoted to what used to be in the realm and the dimensions of forgotten sports, that what used to be in pro sports in particular. We appreciate you finding us in the wilds of podcast land, and we hope and trust that you're doing okay. You're soldiering on. It's not fun. Lots of things that are not fun these days, and sadly, it just continues to be. It just seems to drag on and on and on, and so much uncertainty and so much instability. Absolutely feeling it here. I'm sure you're feeling it in various flavors wherever you are. I hope that our little journey together this week perhaps allays some of those fears, perhaps distracts a bit. And let's enjoy, shall we, a little bit of professional sports as it used to be. And this week we go dial into the Wayback Machine back to a time, an earlier time, during the flourishing days and years of the Negro Leagues. And we get into today, this week, our story with our pal Jim Overmyer, a curious and interesting overlap between local politics in Atlantic City, New Jersey, of all places, and that of professional baseball, Negro League style, as we talk about a team known as the Bacharach Giants of Atlantic City. And that little clip that you just heard was a little floor presentation on the House of Representatives floor by Representative Jeff Van Drew. He is the Republican from New Jersey's 2nd District that encompasses North Wildwood, Vineland, and, of course, Atlantic City, New Jersey. And that was him talking about his co-sponsorship of a commemorative, that's how you say it, Jeff, come on, coin series devoted to that of the Negro Leagues. This is back in March, I think March 11th, about 2 months ago or so. H.R. 4104. I don't know the status of that bill. But it's a safe one for sure, and it makes a lot of sense, if you will. It's the guy representing Atlantic City today, stepping up and remembering a team that was absolutely ensconced in the political firmament of Atlantic City back in the day, in particular, the day of the 1920s and 1930s. The story of the Atlantic City Bacharach Giants, a fascinating tale that essentially was a political creature, this team. Bacharach, who is this guy Bacharach? Well, Harry Bacharach was his name. I don't know. We don't think there was any relation to Burt Bacharach of pop music authorship fame. Perhaps there is. I just didn't have time to figure it out. And Jim didn't seem to think so either. But, regardless, Harry Bacharach was an Atlantic City politician back in the day in the late 1900s, running for mayor. And if you're a fan of the show Boardwalk Empire, you know that politics and other sundry activities in the great seaside city of Atlantic City around that time was, shall we say, a curious endeavor. And one of the curiosities, perhaps one of the little more tame curiosities, was the fact that this Negro League baseball team was essentially sponsored by this Harry Bacharach, or friends of, as we would call it today, who wanted to support his candidacy for mayor, and interestingly became essentially synonymous with this very good team, most of whom came from actually Jacksonville, Florida, of all places. A lot of the players in the pre-version of this team, and we're going to get into all the ins and outs of this fascinating story. This team, obviously representative of lots of things of the Negro Leagues of its day. This Harry Bacharach character, Atlantic City politics, why the two sort of conjoined. And frankly, God forbid we actually talk about the baseball itself. Quite some quality there. As you heard Congressman Van Drew sort of allude to, the beginnings and the inspirations actually for a lot of players. Some who actually played for the AC Bacharach Giants, as well as some of those who were influenced by some of those players in later generations. It's a fascinating story. It intertwines the story of politics in New Jersey and Atlantic City in particular, as well as baseball's history, as well as that specifically of the Negro Leagues. We get into all of that. It's a fascinating tale of the Atlantic City Bacharach Giants with our guest this week, Jim Overmyer. He, the authoritative voice and writer of the definitive book called Black Ball and the Boardwalk, the Bacharach Giants of Atlantic City. And we get into all of that in just a few moments' time in our conversation this week. Fascinating as always, and we appreciate you sticking around for it. And it's coming up in mere moments as we beforehand get to our sponsor of the week, and that is, of course, our friends at Streaker Sports. StreakerSports.com. That's the place to go. Promo code, of course, Good Seats, 10% off all of your purchases. If you haven't been there yet, I don't know what you're waiting for. They call themselves, as you listeners of this show may know by now, the purveyor of sports culture. And it's a trademark term. And for God's sakes, of course, it should be. Because sports culture is in their veins at Streaker Sports. If you remember and love various sports-flavored things such as Caddyshack. Perhaps you are a fan of the original Mighty Ducks or the movie Slapshot. Perhaps you were a kid and you remember The Miracle on Ice in 1980. Maybe you're a Bill Raftery fan with his trademark signature phrase, onions. Well, all of those and a whole bunch of other things are commemorated in a lot of great garb and especially in T-shirts. At Streaker Sports, they're fascinating and officially licensed articles of clothing that you can show and amaze your friends with your various pop cultural references. But of course, beyond the sports culture stuff, we love them and you know them and want to know them for all their great defunct league stuff. They've got perhaps, he says, the most comprehensive collection of T-shirts with all great logos and memories devoted to leagues that we love to commemorate and obsess about, frankly, here on this little show. You're a fan of the World Football League? How about the World Hockey Association? How about the USFL? Maybe Roller Hockey International, or even the tangential pro beach hockey offering from years ago. Maybe you're a fan of the old indoor lacrosse league known as the MILL, the Major Indoor Lacrosse League. How about the ABA, the most colorful of basketball leagues for sure, or perhaps nearest and dearest to our hearts here at Good Seats, still available for various reasons, the Old North American Soccer League. All of those leagues, you will find just about every single stinking team that was in each of those leagues in a tremendous, well-crafted, high-quality T-shirt form at Streaker Sports. StreakerSports.com. And again, use the promo code GOODSEATS, and you're going to get 10%. I wish it were 15. Maybe we could talk to the boys and they can get it up to 15. I don't know. But for now, please be satisfied with 10%. That's a pretty damn good deal, if you ask me. 10% off all of your purchases at StreakerSports.com when you use the promo code GOODSEATS. We thank the good gents at Streaker Sports, the purveyors of sports culture, for their sponsorship of the show. We love their stuff, and you will too. All right, let's segue into our chat now as we dial back the machine, the Wayback Machine, and the circuitry now points us to the mid to late 1900s or so as we get into the beginnings of the story of this fascinating tale of the Negro League team known as the Atlantic City Bacharach Giants. Here's our chat with Jim Overmyer. We appreciate your listening, and here it comes. Please, as always, enjoy. There's just a lingering fascination with all of that of Negro League baseball, including, of course, the topic we're going to get into today. But remind our audience a bit of sort of how you skated into this enormously intriguing world that continues to amaze and delight, I think, even as the years still roll on.
Yes, well, I've been a member of the Society for American Baseball Research since, somewhere in the mid-'80s. And I went to a meeting I lived near Albany, New York at the time. Went to a meeting at the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown in the summer of '88, and my wife Ellen went along because it was a good ride. And she went through the museum when I went to the meeting, and on the way out of town, she said, who is this Effa Manley anyway? And I prided myself being a SABR member of knowing all about baseball, and I said, who is that? She was an owner in the Negro Leagues, and there's a Negro League exhibit in there, and she's featured prominently, and she was a civil rights leader and a good businesswoman, and you ought to write something about her. Oh, okay, I guess I will. Maybe a magazine article if I can find out something about her. Well, before a year was over, I had been informed that when she moved out of Newark, when she had owned the Newark Eagles with her late husband, she left her business papers behind in 2 filing cabinets in the basement of her old house, and somehow they survived not being thrown out or burned up in a fire or flooded in a basement flood or anything. And they wound up being donated to the Newark Public Library, where they are the biggest single primary source of information on the Negro Leagues now and ever. So I went down and started going through those. I took one look at the collection and I said to myself, well, you've never written a book before, but it looks like you're going to now because you can't walk away from this stuff. So I did. And so there was one book, Queen of the Negro Leagues, Effa Manley and the Newark Eagles. Well, then a few years later, I was asked to write a chapter for a book on Ebbets Field. It was basically a collection, not a history of the ballpark in Brooklyn as such, but a collection of essays about different aspects of it, and one was black baseball there. Well, it had been used substantially by 3 teams, the second of which was the Eagles, because they spent their first year in the Negro National League in 1935 in Brooklyn. Well, that was easy. I mean, I'd done that before, so I could do that again. And the third team was the United States League, which was the attempt at a third major league in 1945 and 46, which was, at least so far as the Brooklyn team was concerned, a sort of cover for Branch Rickey's clandestine scouting of black players that resulted in the signing of Jackie Robinson. So kind of everybody in the Negro League historical business knew about that too, so that was pretty easy too. Well, the first team was the Bacharach Giants, who were basically based in Atlantic City. But they played in their early 20s, had transported some of their home games to Ebbets Field and playing around New York, because the black teams barnstormed a lot. And I knew nothing about them. Here's another one of those things I didn't know anything about. And as soon as I get into it, I was hooked. So I wrote, so I researched the Bacharachs, and I did that. I finished that chapter for the book, and I was so interested in the Bacharach Giants that they wound up being my second book a few years after that. Some things I just can't leave alone.
Well, it's interesting. It almost seems like it's sort of like one of those Russian nesting dolls, and maybe you have a few more smaller ones to get to, given
probably
that path, right? Well, okay. So why don't we use that as the branching off point, so to speak? So what is it about the Bacharach Giants that kind of intrigues you? Because my sense is that as you kind of peeled back some of the layers, you maybe sort of maybe just got so hooked into all the various connections and broad topics that this team kind of ventured into, not just being a team in the fledgling Negro leagues, right, on the field.
Well, everything I write about, which is usually baseball and usually black baseball, it happens in context. It happens in historical and economic context. And the Bacharachs were launched at the time of the period in the wild and woolly Atlantic City history that was characterized in that HBO series Boardwalk Empire. In fact, the series was based upon a book written by a local historian in southern New Jersey called Boardwalk Empire. So I'm researching the Bacharachs, and we're watching this on TV, particularly the first couple of seasons before the story started to stray. And I'd say to my wife, Ellen, that really happened. Or Ellen, that happened sort of the way they portrayed it. So I'm researching the book, and I'm seeing the background unspooling on TV every Sunday night.
And your wife gets show notes along the way while she's watching, so she gets completely distracted. Yeah, nice.
Yeah. Well, Atlantic City was someplace. It really was. Fictionalized elements aside, it really was the wide open place that was characterized in the TV series, and the Bacharach Giants were part of that. Although they did not run any gambling houses, and they did not bring in booze off of ships during Prohibition or anything like that. But they have this funny name, the Atlantic City Bacharach Giants. And why Bacharach? Well, there was a member of the political establishment there at the time, whose name was Harry Bacharach. He was actually, he gets very short shrift in the TV series because he was pretty honest. He sort of was a guy who could lie down with dogs but not get very many fleas on him when he got up. But he was, in fact, the mayor, a city commissioner and mayor for several years there, and he was running for re-election in 1916, and a substantial portion of the permanent population, as opposed to this large seasonal population in Atlantic City, was African American, and they voted. And so you really wanted their votes. And one of Jackson's Bacharach's political operatives was a guy named Tom Jackson, who was black and lived there in the North Side community. And he had this great idea. Why don't we get a team in the colored league, as they called it at that time, and name it the Bacharachs? Well, that was a great idea. I didn't have a team yet, but he had a friend who's also in the hospitality business named Henry Tucker, who was a native of Jacksonville, Florida, and had actually managed some black teams there. So Tucker went south, and this is at a particular time in history when there was a large northward migration of blacks in the South. The boll weevil had struck and had ruined the southern cotton crop, putting a lot of sharecroppers and tenant farmers out of business. Also, World War II had started in Europe with cutting off European immigration, and northern industries were begging for workers, railroads, agriculture, steel mills, and the like. They were recruiting heavily in the South, so Tucker went back to Jacksonville and basically recruited one of the top semi-pro black teams there called the Duval Giants. Duval County is where Jacksonville is located. And they got on a train, and they went north to Atlantic City in May of 2016. And they picked up a few other players locally or on the way or through Tucker's contacts. And there, just prior to the election, is this team on the field with Bacharachs on their name, playing before the black crowd. Everybody knew that Harry Bacharach was their sponsor. He threw out the first ball on opening day at a ballpark that he got them. He got permission, or gave permission, since he was also the parks commissioner, for the team to play in a city park where they really probably had no business, but there they were. It was Atlantic City. And so they were the Bacharach Giants. And Bacharach himself was never involved in running the team, but the connection was so strong that the Atlantic City newspapers, trying to get game results into a one-column story and write up a catchy headline. Well, Bacharach's is a pretty long name for a headline, so the newspapers would call them the mayors. Clearly, they were Mayor Bacharach's team. Oh, he won the election and became mayor, right? And so there's just a touch of Atlantic City, not really nefarious, bending the rules maybe a little bit, and nothing illegal, but their whole genesis tells you a lot about power and privilege and corner cutting in Atlantic City in those days.
Well, all right, so a couple of things to unpack there. So number one, circa late 19 teens, right? So this is sort of World War I era stuff. You had sort of this migration stuff going on. Was this Duval Giants team, were they in a semi-pro league themselves, or were they kind of part of this barnstorming sort of independentness? Because it seems like the Atlantic City version, once they were sort of established, that was kind of the way they got going versus sort of joining an actual league per se. Is that right?
I'm not sure if the Duval Giants were in a league in Jacksonville, but and I didn't barnstorm. They all had day jobs and played part-time, but they were the cream of the crop in Jacksonville. And interestingly enough, when Tom Jackson and Henry Tucker inserted them into the Atlantic City Colored League, they wrecked the league. They were so much better than anybody else. And all the fans wanted to see the Bacharachs. No one wanted to go to the other games, and the league fell apart before the season was over. So they were sort of a creative/destructive process in Atlantic City baseball.
They weren't barnstorming per se, but they were, if you will, independent, sort of on a local geographic basis then, both in Jacksonville and then obviously when they became Atlantic City.
Yes, but in Jacksonville they were. In Atlantic City it didn't last because they wanted to expand their horizons, and there were too good. Atlantic City is about 60 miles from Philadelphia. The land there, it's called the Pine Barrens. It's about as flat as a pool table. And by 1916, there were not one but two railroads running back and forth to Philadelphia, which is 60 miles away. And it's become the major hot tourist area there on the southern Jersey shore, and mostly from people from Philadelphia. Well, Philadelphia was full of white semi-pro team, and some black ones too, but mostly white, sponsored by industries, the Brill Company that made streetcars, the John B. Stetson Hat Company. You may have heard of the Stetson hat. A lot of people out here in Arizona wear them. John B. Stetson Company made the Stetson hats for the Cowboys. Department stores sponsored teams. There was just teams all over the place. And the Bacharachs would take the train to Philadelphia to play them. More importantly, Pennsylvania had a ban on Sunday baseball until the 1930s. I'm not sure if New Jersey had a ban on Sunday baseball, but in Atlantic City, if the local authorities didn't want to enforce a law or a rule, it stayed unenforced. So the Philadelphia teams were more than happy to get on that same train and come to Atlantic City to play the Bacharachs on Sundays when they couldn't play at home. Sunday always being a great day to play baseball. A lot of people with nothing to do in the afternoon will come and pay and see you play. So the Bacharachs had a easily established a relationship with the hotbed of semi-pro ball in Philadelphia, which actually sustained them for a long time, but really was their major source of games and income up until World War I.
So it almost feels like maybe arguably through sort of today, Atlantic City is almost as a team, I guess, it's almost sort of a regional exposure in some respects, because you've got Philadelphia tourists and vacationers sort of keeping Atlantic City sort of on their radar, and the fact that it's relatively close, right? It almost feels like you've got a bigger base, I guess, than what you would normally consider Atlantic City, which itself is certainly much smaller, certainly much more seasonally inflated in terms of population, and arguably a bigger market, if you will, to draw, or at least be aware amongst.
Atlantic City at the time had a permanent population of about 25,000 people on major weekends in the summer. There were 6 weekends. They called them the Big Six. 6 weekends, which was really the focus of tourism, and the town would have 200,000 or 300,000 people on those weekends. And most of them would go back, obviously. And and the temporary population inflated because all the hotels and restaurants and amusements needed seasonal workers. So it was Atlantic City and Philadelphia were very, I suspect to a certain extent still are, were very closely linked. Atlantic City was the recreational outlet for Philadelphia. It was so easy to get there. It was literally an hour's train ride each way.
All right. So so the other thing to sort of unpack here is that, and I want to get into Bacharach himself in a second, but this is a promotional endeavor, right? More than anything else, right? The idea of recruiting a team and then slapping Harry Bacharach's name associated with it, it feels like just simply a grand promotional play more than anything else.
It was a promotional endeavor, a political promotional endeavor, which was not unusual. It was not the only case in which a sports team or an amateur athletic club was named after a local politician. This had happened before Bacharach, and it happened after Bacharach, really. But the Giants were another example of this happening, and the only African American one that I'm aware of. That made it somewhat different.
Well, all right. So give me a sense of this Harry Bacharach guy, because you claim he's relatively clean, if you will, to that of the far more intriguing set of characters in the Boardwalk Empire world. But, he also had his moments of, it seems like a questionable, or at least investigated sort of shenanigans or perceived shenanigans around politics, right? Messy, especially around that time. So even the cleanest of politicians, so to speak, that's got to be a relative statement, right?
Harry was only indicted once, which is a pretty good track record, and that was for election fraud.
There you go. Only indicted.
That was for election fraud, which in Atlantic City is sort of like jaywalking, or at least at the time was sort of like somewhere between jaywalking and pinching an apple from a street side fruit vendor, and this happened in 2010 when Woodrow Wilson was elected governor of New Jersey. The machine in Atlantic City was solid Republican, and when all the votes were counted, it turned out that there were more votes in Atlantic County for the Republican candidate for governor than there were registered voters, which sort of set off a lot of alarm bells in the Capitol at Trenton. So the state launched an investigation and started indicting people, including Harry. Atlantic County launched its own investigation and indicted all the major figures on the other side, all the Democrats. So the whole thing sort of fell apart. And after 2 or 3 years, Bacharach's indictment and many others were dismissed because it was just impossible to prosecute them. Harry, he had a lot. He turned out to be a very good mayor. He was also the U.S. postmaster. His brother Isaac was the congressman from that area in South Jersey. They had actually a very good record. Bacharach, there was no civil service. Bacharach was as prone to anyone else as dumping, when he got into office, to dump the supporters of the previous mayor out on the street and hire his own people in City Hall and all of that. But he was pretty well liked and admired. In the 30s, I don't remember the guy's name now, but the sitting mayor was under investigation, which ended when he managed to get himself killed in a train wreck along with the 4 passengers. His car was hit by a train. And so the office was vacant, and the city council considered who to appoint, and they drafted Bacharach and put him in. And it was a terrible time. I mean, the city was facing bankruptcy. In the middle of the Depression, the city was facing bankruptcy. Tourism had dropped off. Bacharach had a lot of connections. He was on a couple of part-time New Jersey state commissions, and he pulled all the strings that is available. Got some debts forsworn. Got a large loan to the city, and by the time the Depression was over, the city had weathered through it and was doing. Tourism picked up and things are going very well. And Harry got a lot of credit for that.
So he's okay. So this is completely intriguing. So it almost feels like this is a bit of a rehabilitation effort for him, circa 16 or so, because he'd obviously been investigated and obviously part of I want to call it freewheeling, but certainly a politics in Atlantic City, not necessarily the cleanest and most well lit of endeavors, right? But it feels almost like it was sort of a not only a promotional thing, but kind of a way to kind of maybe better ingratiate himself, not only from a promotional perspective, but maybe from a civic perspective as well from his political allies.
Yes, the city government consisted of 5 commissioners who were elected at large, and one of them then became the mayor. And he was a commissioner already, but he wanted to be mayor. And it generally went to the commissioner who got the most votes in the election was probably going to be mayor unless there was a good reason for the others to conspire against him. And he wanted to be the top vote getter, and he wanted to be the mayor. And sure enough, in the 1916 election, he was the top vote getter and became the mayor. Did having the Bacharach Giants on the field during the campaign push him over the top? Well, who knows? He had very good relations. He had very good relations with the African American community. In fact, Jackson, who was a black guy, the premier owner of operator of the team, was an African American political operative on the north side there where the blacks lived. So Harry had good connections with the black community. Jackson and Tucker made them even better, and he was the top vote getter in the election and became the mayor. Now, is this a string of causality? Not necessarily, but there was certainly a relationship there.
All right. Well, I guess the question then sort of nets out to who's using who here, right? Is it
they're using each other.
Well, okay. So maybe get a little bit into that, because it seems like it's obviously opportunity for baseball and all that stuff. Some of the things we've talked about just generally, but also obviously slapping a white Jewish mayor's name on ostensibly a largely or fully Negro league or African American league baseball endeavor, right? You're mentioning good relations, but it also seems sort of very convenient, so to speak.
It's very convenient. One hand was definitely washing the other. The Bacharach, Harry, and his brother Isaac continued to support the team throughout the 20s. They were finding a ballpark in Atlantic City for anybody was always a problem because the city was it's basically on a glorified sandbar just off the coast of New Jersey, and land is dear, and as development kept going on, it became harder and harder to find good places to build a ballpark. When that was a problem, the Bacharachs often stepped in. The best park they had for the most of their period was a piece of undeveloped residential land that Isaac Bacharach rented from a developer and let the Bacharachs use for 5 years. Harry I think there was there might have been some behind-the-scenes financial support of the team, too. It's very hard to figure that out. Direct financial support, very hard to figure that out now. But clearly, the Bacharach brothers found them places to play and things like that. On the other hand, there's the connection between Harry and Isaac Bacharach, who needed votes too, although he represented a much larger constituency than Atlantic City. And there's their name constantly being bandied about on the north side, the black community of Atlantic City. It worked pretty well for both sides.
Who's running this club, right? So obviously the branding is there, but Bacharach and his brother are not running the club. How are the players being stocked, and how is the team itself being managed? And frankly, where are they playing? They're obviously independent, but I also, from my crack research, they also seem to be sort of informally related to the Negro National League at the time, 1920 or so, as well.
Yes. They were pretty much a local or regional, Atlantic City, Philadelphia, and the areas in between, to the end of 1918, when they almost went out of business. The beginning of the war, the really active American participation in the war, caused a drop-off in attendance all across the board, including the majors. In Philadelphia, a lot of the semi-pro teams folded because the players were getting drafted. The Bacharach Giants barely finished the season. In fact, they lost players of their own, either because they couldn't pay them or because they got drafted. This is something I uncovered researching the book. In August of 1918, they stumbled through the end of their season as an integrated team. They picked up 3 or 4 of the better white semi-pros in Atlantic City to fill vacancies. So you actually had an integrated black team playing for about a month, which is pretty unknown. One of them, in fact, was a guy named Whitey Grueller, who was 17 years old at the time. He played that month for them. Later, he became a sports writer, and he became sports editor of the Atlantic City Daily Press, and in the 40s was a constant proponent of integration of Major League Baseball before Jackie Robinson. And you got to wonder if Whitey just didn't sort of get his start there playing alongside black players in 1918. So yes, so they almost went out of business, and then there was the thing that saves a lot of businesses, somebody with cash and influence. And Jackson took in 2 partners from New York City. One was John Connors, who had been he ran restaurants in Brooklyn and then in Harlem. And he was pretty popular in that regard, but he was also very popular as successful as a baseball impresario. He had a semi-pro black team in Brooklyn as early as 1904. And he was forced out of business by a white business opponent named Nat Strong, who sort of dominated the semi-pro scene in New York City by tying up available baseball fields and charging people to use them. So Connor was put out of business, and he was happy to jump at the opportunity with the Bacharachs. And he brought in a business partner who had probably even more money than him, a guy named Baron Wilkins, who was one of the leading speakeasy operators in Harlem, and had some sporting interest. He was a backer of Jack Johnson, the prize fighter, and interested in sports, not as a hands-on guy, but as somebody like to put some money into it and enjoy it. So they bought into the Bacharachs and rejuvenated the team. And this is, in fact, when they started playing part-time in New York City. Because they were from New York City, they wanted the team to play in New York City. They wanted to be outside of the grip of Nat Strong. They didn't want to be paying him a fee to use a ballpark. And Ebbets Field, Strong had no sway over Ebbets Field or the Polo Grounds. So they wound up at Ebbets Field for several important home series in those early 20s. So the team was rejuvenated, and then there's still no league ball in the East. But as you pointed out, the Negro National League had started out in the Midwest in 1920, and the Bacharachs. Rube Foster was the president, the very energetic and powerful president of the Negro National League, and he offered Eastern clubs what were called associate memberships. You could be an associate member of his league, which gave you the opportunity to schedule games with his teams, which of course were potential moneymakers. It also allowed you to be exempt from his league teams raiding your rosters, treating you like an independent team, and where free agency reigned among the players and siphoning off your players. And of course, you couldn't siphon off his league's players either. But it was an arrangement that was often used in the Negro leagues, and the Bacharachs became the first associate member of the Negro National League in 1920, which helped them a lot. They then they stayed associates of the Negro National League and so they were playing a lot of more high-class black teams and traveling to New York City more and playing in the high-level semi-pro world, white world of semi-pro ball in New York City. Things were going very well. And then in 1923, the primary Eastern teams, most of whom were Negro National League associates, came to what was in retrospect, seems like a pretty obvious conclusion that they should have their own league. So the Eastern Colored League was founded, stretching from New York City to Baltimore. It was pretty compact. You didn't have to pay the train expenses to go all the way to Detroit or Chicago to play the National League teams. You could play among yourselves, and then if you wanted to, you could take a barnstorming trip west, or the Western teams would come and see you for a barnstorming trip, which was always profitable. So the Eastern Colored League was founded in 1923, and the Bacharachs were charter members, bringing us up to how they got into a league.
Yeah, so maybe you sort of touched on it, but why would they not have gone the Negro National League route and foster maybe not sort of trying to, if you will, expand from the Midwest to the East Coast, given a handful of associates at this point? I would always imagine that Foster might have looked at the founding of this Eastern Color League almost as an affront. Maybe.
Well, he did.
Okay.
As a matter of fact, he looked at it very much as an affront, and they didn't. Negotiations for a Negro World Series, which you would have thought would have been a sort of an automatic, dragged on for a year, and the first series didn't take place until 1924. A lot of the colored teams were very undercapitalized because they catered primarily to 10% of the American population, which tended to be people who held lower income jobs, and there simply was not that It simply was not the discretionary income to buy ballpark tickets that there were among the whites. And so barnstorming was very important, going on a road for a week or two at a time, and hitting some cities and playing some Negro League opponents, but playing all these little towns along the way as you picking up money all the way. The travel to the Midwest, the costs were extensive. Ed Bolden, who ran the team called Hilldale in Philadelphia, when the Eastern League was founded, wrote in the Philadelphia Tribune that basically I can play a week here in Philadelphia where my players can walk to work and make more money than I would after putting them on a train to Chicago and paying their way to and from Chicago for a series. So it was a matter primarily of economics. It would be, taking a trip to the Midwest from the East and playing a bunch of teams and coming back, say, for 2 months or 2 weeks rather, would be a good thing. Having to go there all the time was a bad thing, financially a bad thing.
But almost immediately, right? You've got Atlantic City and this Eastern Color League essentially kind of, arguably playing in some maybe more major markets, being in the East Coast and stuff. So before we sort of get into the Giants a little bit more, where it feels like there was almost I won't call it an uneasy piece, right? But there was certainly some postseason collaboration as the years went on between these two leagues, right?
Yes, the ambassadors went to work, and the first Negro World Series was played in 1924 between the Eastern Colored League champion and the Negro National League champion, and there was then a Negro World Series in 25, 26, and 27. There may have been more, but the economy got worse leading up to the Great Depression, and the Eastern Colored League went out of business in the middle of 1928, which, of course, ended that relationship. Of course, the Negro National League was only a few years behind in doing the same thing. But so there were 24, 25. There were 4 Negro World Series between the ECL and the National League, and the Bacharachs were in 2 of them, although they didn't manage to win either of them. They got better and better as time went on, and they were really a good team by the mid-20s.
Well, let's talk about that team a little bit. So give me a sense of some of these players. We haven't really mentioned some of their names yet, but there's some really intriguing and solid characters on this team, and maybe a little bit of how they were getting better, right? I mean, Bacharach how much did he know about the doings of the team, and or who was running all of the sort of on-field stuff, and where are these players coming from?
Well, you had Tom Jackson was the primary owner, and then he brought in Connor and Baron Wilkins from New York City, who basically neutralized Jackson. They were big money guys, and Jackson he was connected with the team, but he didn't have the power that he had before. Baron Wilkins and Connor, well, let's give credit to Connor. He was really the baseball man. He knew a lot of people. He brought John Henry Lloyd to the team. Pop Lloyd, the Hall of Famer, considered to be maybe the best black shortstop there ever was. I mean, one of the best shortstops anywhere there ever was. He brought Lloyd to the team. Lloyd became the manager. Lloyd became the star of the team, or one of the stars of the team. Interestingly enough, Lloyd was getting a little on in years when he came to the Bacharachs, and one of his first managerial decisions was to shift himself to second base, because at shortstop was basically his successor as the best shortstop at the time, Dick Lundy, who had been one of the original Duval Giants. He was 17 years old when he came up from Jacksonville in 1916. And before many years were gone, he was regarded as, the up-and-coming young infield star in black baseball. So Lloyd switched himself to second base. Lundy stayed at shortstop. So you've got now an all-star up the middle situation there. Outfielders, they really, we like to say, well, this team had so many Hall of Famers. Well, besides Lloyd and Ben Taylor, who played for the team early on, and then at the very end, he managed the team and was a part-time player. That's the only two Hall of Famers they had. But they had lots of guys in that tier below. There's an outfielder named Cheney White, who's really overlooked, I think. I don't know if he's Hall of Fame category, but he doesn't get the credit he should. He was in center field for several years. A guy named Arthur Henderson, whose nickname was Rats, because when he was a young man going to work, he opened his lunch pail and one of his workmates had put a rat in his lunch pail, and it jumped out and scared him to death. So for thereafter, supposedly, Arthur Henderson was Rats Henderson. But he was a real good pitcher, and he pitched for them throughout the 20s. Had Red Greer, his career was kind of short, but it was really outstanding. While it lasted, he pitched the first Negro World Series no-hitter for the Bacharachs in 1926. The team had one of their star players. Again, I wouldn't exactly say Oliver Marcel is underrated. The people who know the best players realize he was one of the outstanding third basemen.
Nicknamed Ghost, right?
Yeah, the Ghost. He was also an awful person to put up with. He had a terrible temper. He was on the field. He was a great player. Apparently, he made an outstanding diving stop in that no-hitter to save Greer's no-hitter in the ninth inning. But he'd argue with the fans. He'd argue with the umpires. He'd argue with his teammates.
Yeah,
so
we had a conversation about Oscar Charleston in a previous episode. It looks like they even had a couple of scraps along the way too. So and Charleston being arguably one of the best of all time based on current recollections.
Well, Marcel kind of went beyond that. He was involved in this situation in 1924. Where he was traded twice from the New York Lincoln Giants to the Bacharachs in the same season. He had just become apparently intolerable, but then he was involved in a late-night incident in Harlem where a guy was shot to death on the street after an all-night party at 3 a.m, and 3 people were there. And it was Marcel, Frank Wickware, who was a pitcher for the Lincoln Giants, and another pitcher named Dave Brown. Well, no one was ever quite sure what happened, but it's interesting that Dave Brown immediately vanished and was never seen in professional black baseball again. It's a little suspicious, but he blew town and no one ever found him. And Wickware and Marcel seemed to have come out of it fairly clean, but this was sort of the last straw for the Lincoln Giants, and then so they get this guy out of town. Well, the Bacharachs, who had Marcel on the roster previously, needed a third baseman badly and wanted him, so they worked out a trade for 2 pitchers, Marcel for a couple of pitchers. One of them was sick at home in the South and refused to report, so the trade fell through. But the Lincolns still wanted to get Marcel out of the town, and the Bacharachs still needed a third baseman, so they worked out another trade. And this time, everybody agreed to go, and so Oliver came back to Atlantic City and was the all-star third baseman through their best years, their pennant-winning years.
How were they received by the fans? Like from what you could tell, I mean, were they popular at the gate, so to speak? Obviously winning certainly doesn't hurt, especially winning the titles in 26 and 27. But did it matter? Was the market big enough? Was Philadelphia a draw? Could you tell by any of your recollections or your investigation about like how well they were, supported?
I think they were much admired by the black population of Atlantic City. But making a dollar in baseball, in professional baseball in Atlantic City, was a problem. It was a problem later, and it would probably be a problem today, because this was true in the 20s. Hammond Daniels, who was the team president in 1923, after the season was over, told one of the papers that says, basically in so many words, there's just too much going on in Atlantic City. The theory is
like the Las Vegas situation, right? I mean, that seems to be getting a little different and more diverse now. But the idea of Las Vegas seems sexy on paper, yet there's so many other distractions. That's not why people go to Las Vegas for, if you will, watching a sporting event, right, or sporting teams on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's like, wow, there's so much going on here. People, when they're not strolling the boardwalk or on the beach or gambling, would be happy to go to a ball game, wouldn't they? Well, no, really. The farther away you get from the boardwalk, the thinner the interest gets. And this happened to the Bacharachs. It also happened in the early 2000s. There was an attempt. The city built a really nice 10,000-seat stadium called Sandcastle Stadium. And they got a team in the Atlantic League, an independent minor league. And within 10 years, the team was gone. I mean, people just come to see them play. People were focused on what was happening on the boardwalk, and that's what they did. So the Bacharachs had a lot of money troubles after the first few years. They inched along, and in 1929, as a league level professional team, they were out of business, and the odd structure of how money flows and what people are interested in Atlantic City had a lot to do with that. I think if they were in some other city, they would have done better. If they were in some other city, they wouldn't have existed in the first place. But so their real life consisted of only about a dozen years. The franchise went out of business, and it got a promoter in Philadelphia named Harry Bacharach. I wouldn't say he bought the rights to the name, because I think there was nothing to buy by the end of 1929. But he fired up the idea of the Bacharach Giants again in Philadelphia as mostly a regional professional black team through the 30s until the World War II drove them out of business. And they had a little bit of they cycled a lot of good players through there in Philadelphia. Roy Campanella got his start catching for the Bacharach Giants in Philly, but they were never regarded as a league level team the way they were when they were in Atlantic City.
All right, a couple little pieces here that sort of stick out from my sort of investigation here. They won titles in this Eastern Colored League 26 and 27, which qualified them for this Negro League World Series, which we sort of alluded to as this sort of, I guess, true, if you will, Negro League final sort of championship with that of the Negro National League. But they lost both of those series in 26 and 27 to the Chicago American Giants, which of course was they were a power for various reasons in the Negro National League now, weren't they? The Giants, the American Giants.
Yes, Rube Foster by then had suffered his eventually life-terminating mental breakdown and was no longer involved in the team. But the team on the field was Rube's team. He'd put it together, and he was, everyone agrees, I think, that he was the premier owner, organizer, talent scout, and manager ever in the Negro Leagues. So this was a good team. Interestingly enough, actually, the championship series was the best 5 out of 9. So rather than 4 out of 7 as in the White World Series, you had to win 5 to win. And that's Greer's no-hitter came along the way. He started the second game of the series, and he was terrible. He got knocked out in the second inning. And Lundy, who was the manager by then, decided, pitching staffs in the Negro Leagues are thin, and Well, Red, you didn't work too hard. Why don't you take the ball and start the third game? Well, okay, he did, and he threw a no-hitter. So that and some other good fortune, the Bacharachs, after 6 games, the Bacharachs had won 4 of them. They only needed to win 1 of the last 3 games to be the champions, and they lost them all. It was an awful letdown. So in 27, they're back. They win. They dominate the last full season of the Eastern Colored League, and they're back. And who's back from the National League but the Chicago American Giants? And the Bacharachs get another World Series no-hitter. I mean, the major leagues only have Don Larson's perfect game, but the Negro leagues in their short period had 2 World Series no-hitters. A guy named Luther Red Farrell, who was another left-handed pitcher, who was probably pretty much the dominant starter for them that season in 27. Pitched another no-hitter, not nearly as fancy as Greer's. It was in Chicago. It was raining. It was dark, and the game went only 7 innings, and due to walks and errors, the Bacharachs gave up 2 runs. So it was hardly a sort of polished gem you might expect, but it was a no-hitter nonetheless. But still, the Chicago American Giants, being who they were, wound up winning that World Series too. But the Bacharachs were in it 2 years in a row, which is nothing to be ashamed of.
That's very interesting. All right, before we get to sort of the end of that sort of that coda of that league and their 1929 adventure, let me back up for a second. Where's Bacharach in all of this? Because he's not he ends his first mayoral term, or maybe second mayoral term, in 1920, right? But here's the decade of the 20s. Like, why are they even still called the Bacharach Giants? I mean, does he even care anymore? I mean, is the promotional value of this team, or is it just sort of so entrenched as part of their name? And why that still, and how involved, or does he even have any involvement at all? Or
it was
in the team?
Very little, other than he dropped out of local politics in 1920. His daughter died at a very young age, and it was a great deal of family trouble. He decided not to run for re-election in 20, although he did decide to run in 24 as the reform candidate. But there was always a lot to reform in Atlantic City, but he didn't win. And then he dropped out of local politics. As I said, he was on a couple of New Jersey state commissions. He kept his hand in, and then he was called back, to help straighten the mess out in the 30s. He was a businessman. He was in his family. The family business was men's clothing, and they were based in Philadelphia, but they had in New York. They had an Atlantic City outlet. He got into real estate. Everybody was in real estate. Tom Jackson was in real estate. Real estate. If you weren't actually providing hospitality services, you were in real estate selling property to support the hospitality services. So Harry was well off upper middle class in business. He kept his connections with the team were below the surface, in a sense, or below the horizon. He was supporting them in ways, finding them a place to play and attending the games. He was seen at a lot of games. He'd cheer the team on and all of that. But no, he never had a real operational correct connection with the team, even when he was the mayor. Well, I take that back a little. He did. It turns out, in the beginning, if you wanted to schedule a game with the Bacharachs in the late teens, you would call this guy who worked at City Hall, who, I don't know what he did for City Hall, but he was the booking agent for the Bacharachs when Harry was the mayor. But later on, no, his connection with the team became less and less. He and his brother would support them in ways they needed to be supported by renting property, leasing property that they could turn into a ball field and stuff like that. But really, by the mid to late 20s, there was no real connection anymore except the name. And why change the name? They were well known as the Bacharach Giants. Why would they? They wouldn't want to. They were in a league. They were world or league champions and World Series participants. Why would you want to change the name, even if the name didn't mean that much anymore?
No, it's interesting. I just wonder the business aspect of that too. As the team obviously gained more success, does the business elements of it sort of warrant perhaps a rethink of the name, or arguably, maybe you're making the case, why mess with a good thing? Because that is at least a reference and a brand equity, I guess, that's been built up, even though the namesake doesn't have any real involvement with the team.
Yeah, and people were used to the name. It's interesting that after the franchise was relocated to Philadelphia by Harry Bacharach, now not only is Bacharach not even remotely involved, the team isn't even in Atlantic City anymore, but they continue to be called all throughout the 30s the Bacharach Giants, because that's what people were used to, I guess.
All right. Well, let's maybe just in a roundabout way, sort of maybe ask this sort of last sort of question, because there seems to be one further curiosity we haven't sort of touched on here, and that is 1929, right? So the Eastern Color League kind of collapses at the end of 28, obviously with the defending champion Atlantic City Bacharach Giants. What is this American Negro League in 1929 that Atlantic City and a bunch of other teams go to? Is this something that sort of comes out of the embers of the Eastern Colored League? And maybe a little bit of description, because it only lasts itself a year, and maybe obviously 1929 is a hint historically as to maybe why that was the case.
Yeah. Yes, the ECL went out of business in the middle of 28, and I mean the body was no sooner buried, so to speak, than the sports writers in the East started saying, "We need a league. We really should have a league. There's still a league in the Midwest. We need a league in the East." So in the off season, things came together. 5 of the 6 teams that had been in the late Eastern Colored League got together and formed the American Negro League, and they needed a 6th team, and for the first time, a perpetual holdout from league play, although a very good team, the Homestead Grays from Pittsburgh joined the league. So you had a 6-team league, and it was actually a pretty good league. The ECL was famous or infamous for poor discipline and scheduling problems, even and umpiring problems and everything else. And the ANL actually solved a lot of those problems, and it was a pretty well-run league. But now, I mean, we think of the Great Depression as starting on that day in October when the stock market went straight south, but really there had been a cutback in the American economy since around 1927, particularly in manufacturing in the northern cities, and a lot of the African American employees of these manufacturing businesses had been recently hired at lower level jobs. You know what they say, last in, first out, when the going gets tough. So the black communities were taking a serious economic earnings hit prior to any. So
they were also a leading economic indicator, so to speak.
They were a leading economic indicator. Yes, it was. And if you look at, if you delve into the economic, the census economic stats at the time, you can actually see it. Unemployment was growing in the manufacturing, and the blacks were taking the brunt of it. So the American Negro League had a lot of things going for it, and one thing it didn't have going for it was paying fans. So it went out of business in 1929. By 1931, the Negro National League had followed it, and the white minor leagues were cut way back, and I believe white major league attendance I plunged 25% over the course of a couple of years. But the black leagues were always on the cusp. They were just because of who their fans were and how their owners were unable maybe to get leverage financing to build ballparks or meet long-term payrolls and stuff like that. The Negro Leagues in the era we're talking about, the time before and the time after up through the 40s, were always tenuous, more tenuous than the white leagues, let's put it that way, which makes sense if you think about it.
Oh, sure. So I guess the last sort of piece of this would be the maybe interesting sort of way that the Bacharach Giants sort of ended their first sort of real life and then their only life that year in the A&L in 29. You know, they're coming in as, if you will, the de facto defending champions of this circuit from their ECL predecessor. But it's also not lost upon me that they traded some of their best players to the eventual winner of that league in 1929. Maybe evidence of, frankly, just how financially difficult it was for Atlantic City, particularly, to keep going. But it seems to me, based on what I can read here, is that Atlantic City kind of gave away their chance to maybe defend their title by giving away some of the best players.
They did. They were owned by that time by a local guy named Isaac Washington, who was in the real estate business, of course. He was also in the numbers business. He was also the numbers gambling baron of Atlantic City. So he had some money, but he apparently was a hard guy to get along with. And he and Lundy had a progressively growing falling out. And Marcel was, always able to destroy the good graces of anybody he was playing for, sooner or later. So they were traded to the Baltimore Black Sox for Ben Taylor, who reappears on the scene. And Lundy had been the manager of the Bacharach, so Taylor, who was manager of the Black Sox in Baltimore, became the manager of the Bacharachs. But so you had traded manager for manager. Well, Taylor's in the Hall of Fame. He's regarded as a great all-time manager, but you got to have somebody to play with at the same time. And the player base was greatly undermined. And in addition, I think they were having trouble playing players. People were deserting them. There were still lots of independent teams around you could go and play with, who weren't bound by any contractual limitations on who they could sign. So yes, they lost a lot of talent, particularly Lundy and Marcel, and the team just wasn't going anywhere. Even if the American Negro League had been a thriving operation, the Bacharachs of 29 would still have been down around last place.
Well, all this is very interesting because there's a lot of different sort of pieces of intrigue here. The whole Atlantic City experience, obviously the Depression, obviously the Negro Leagues generally. But I guess sort of as a wrap-up question, I Atlantic City, right? Still, even in this sort of description here and this sort of history, it still doesn't feel to me like a quote unquote major league worthy city, because just of its size relatively and its seasonality when it comes to being economically strong enough. I don't want to get into sort of the demise or the sidewaysness of Atlantic City over the years since then, right? But it strikes me as being interesting. It's not a Baltimore, right? It's not a Philadelphia. It's not even a metropolitan Pittsburgh, right? Atlantic City is a resort town then and now, and I'm surprised that it would have lasted as long and as arguably successfully as it did in, you said, it as an already shaky economic enterprise that was the Negro Leagues at that time, and frankly for most of their time. That they were able to kind of, sweat it out and be that relatively successful and well-known as much as they were for that period of time.
Well, it is a little surprising because Atlantic City was a very seasonal place. Of course, the high season was the baseball season. So, I think that helped. At least it either really helped or the entrepreneurs who wanted to make a go of it thought that it ought to help. One of the two. Atlantic City is an odd choice for a major league franchise location, even at the Negro League level. But on the other hand, I mean, the city is basically a glorified sandbar. It has no industries. It has no sustaining corporate business structure other than that of the casinos in these days, or the hotels in the old days. I mean, you can't even, there's no mining there. You have to pipe in fresh water from the mainland because you can't dig a well without getting salt water. And people who die in Atlantic City are transported back to the mainland because the Atlantic City cemetery is on the mainland because you can't bury them there either. So it was built on like a dream, and has sustained itself with its ups and downs over the years as a sort of dream place. So if your dream, and let's face it, a lot of historically, no matter what ethnic background or racial background, a lot of people get into owning professional teams because it's the great dream of theirs. So if you're going to have a dream about that, why not have it in Atlantic City, even if it didn't work in the long run?
No, that's true. And that's certainly a theme that we've seen on a lot of different fronts, various dreamers and, people trying to align themselves with, things that help sort of personally aggrandize, ego and power, perception, influence, just fun, big boys with their toys, all that kind of stuff. All right. So here's sort of the last sort of component of the question. Is there any sort of lineage since then? Like, has any of this, where does the history and or the legacy of these Atlantic City versions of this team live? Has anybody sort of claimed them? Is there any sort of either diaspora or direct or somewhere in between lineage? Would any team of today, for example, have any sort of lay claim to their history and being able to sort of tap into their nostalgia, if you will, and their logos and all that kind of stuff? Or are they just kind of, one of the many sort of Negro League teams that have sort of just came and went, so to speak, with really no final, if you will, historical resting place?
Well, there's one connection, which is currently dormant, but I don't think it's going to remain so. John Henry Lloyd moved back after he played in a lot of different places, but when he retired, he moved to Atlantic City because he liked it there. And he lived there the rest of his life. He was a custodian at the black high school, and he taught kids to play ball, and everybody just loved him. And in the late 40s, the city built a ballpark with a covered grandstand and everything, and they called it John Henry Lloyd Stadium. And it was used, and then, of course, the way things go, the city in the 60s, fell in hard financial times, and they let the thing go to hell. And in the 70s, a group formed to rehabilitate the stadium. And they called themselves the John Henry Lloyd Foundation, and they held fundraisers, and they held a weekend convention, and they raised money, and the ballpark was fixed up. And that took a couple of years, and then they looked around and said, we're having a really good time. Why stop? So they continued, the John Henry Lloyd Foundation continued to hold an annual get-together where they would give awards to people, and they had sort of three levels. Former major leaguers and Negro leaguers were obviously a source, and there were local community leaders could get awards, and they had this also people who were doing things, people on the national stage who were doing things for children. So there were 3 levels of awards, and they would have a weekend get-together, which I went to several of them, and they'd have this wonderful thing. And it was all about Pop Lloyd, and the Bacharachs were always in the mix. And it's like a lot of things. There were a small group of a guy named Mike Everett, who was a retired teacher there, was the main person, and Belinda Manning, who's the daughter of Max Manning's, the former Negro League pitcher, was very involved. And they got tired. They got older. They got tired. They couldn't find anybody to take over. And the thing lapsed about 3 years ago, which is really too bad because it was a wonderful weekend. And Mike had the idea of having, because it's 2020, the 100th anniversary of the founding of the first Negro National League, had the idea of putting together a revival this October, but travel restrictions and everything is too chancy, so it's been canceled. But I have a feeling they'll be back. So the Bacharachs sort of live on in the Pop Lloyd Foundation, so they're not completely out of the picture, and you know their retro jerseys and hats you can find them around, but other than that,
yeah, and you wonder.
It's kind of it's not like the Philadelphia Phillies will wear the Stars uniforms on Negro League Day, or the Yankees will wear the Black Yankees or whatever. There's nobody there to pick up that thread, but it's not entirely forgotten.
No, and you wonder too. I mean, this is probably one of a number of fascinating stories in Negro League history that perhaps could be further adopted by any of the minor or major league teams, right? If you could probably squint really hard and try to figure out some kind of loose connection, but it almost feels like it's an orphaned team that could do well by being remembered or commemorated once and hopefully again. Baseball sort of gets back up and running again. I'd
certainly like to see it.
Yeah, certainly a team that's got some colorful history behind it, as well as some Hall of Fame players, both in the Negro League Museum Center as well as of Cooperstown variety. So, look, this is this is partially the reason why we do this silly little show. Is we love discovering teams that were for a time, for various reasons, alive and vibrant and interesting and full of stories and history and stuff. And this is absolutely one that hits our radar really hard. And God forbid it gets people to kind of discover it anew. And maybe do their own sort of research and maybe rehabilitate and or bring back to life in some way, shape, or form, memorably, for others to discover and remember and understand too. Especially in New Jersey, the great state of New Jersey, where I was born. God forbid, that we remember teams from the Garden State. And look, this has been great. So how about promoting a little bit? This how do people find out about this particular story that you wrote and some of the other things that you've written?
Well, this book is called Black Ball and the Boardwalk. It is published by McFarland Books, and they're online at mcfarlandbooks.com. They're from Jefferson, North Carolina. They have the biggest list of Negro League history books or black baseball history books that I know of. They have a lot of them. They have another one of mine on Cumberland Posey and the Homestead Grays, and they have its field book that kind of dragged me into this Bacharach thing in the first place. But anyway, yeah, McFarlandBooks.com, and they can be found, on the usual internet outlets. But one I particularly push is bookshops.org, which is a outlet for independent bookstores. Part of the proceeds go to independent bookstores. So that's that one, and I have two others out right now. It's very odd. You're right. You think you're only going to get a book out every few years, and all of a sudden, various reasons, two of them come out at the same time. There's Cumberland Posey, Posey and the Homestead Grays, which is the biography of the Hall of Fame owner of the Grays in the second Negro National League, and that's also published by McFarland. And a second edition of my first book about Effa Manley, Queen of the Negro Leagues, is now out from Roman and Littlefield, R-O-W-M-A-N, not like the ancient Italians, but R-O-W-M-A-N and Littlefield, which is ROWMAN.com. That's available from them and all of those other online sources. This updates, she was elected to the Hall in 2006, the same time Posey was, and my first version was published long before that, so we updated it to honor her for being the first and probably in the foreseeable future only woman member of the Hall of Fame. So those are the three that are out there.
Our kind thanks at the tip of a very old and dusty baseball cap to our new pal, Jim Overmyer. He will be back. We're going to have some other conversations around some Negro League things in future episodes. But in the meantime, I know that you will enjoy the book that Jim has written. It's the authoritative, definitive work about the Atlantic City Bacharach Giants. It's fascinating stuff. It's called Black Ball and the Boardwalk, the Bacharach Giants of Atlantic City. It is available in paperback form from our friends at McFarland & Company. It's also available in Kindle form. And, of course, you'll find a link to both of those versions on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this little episode with Jim Overmyer, and you'll find not only the descriptive contents of this episode, but you'll also find some convenient links to these versions of book for you to purchase, download, or otherwise enjoy, as well as, frankly, while you're there, all the dozens of other shows that we've done over the last 3.5, almost 4 years now. They're all there for you on the website, as well as your ability to share them, to stream them, do whatever you want with them. And of course, while you're at Good Seats Still Available, make sure that you sign up for our weekly newsletter so you can know what's coming up in the weeks ahead. And you'll find a link there conveniently. You also find a link to our email address, which happens to be hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. And of course, you can send us a note directly that way if you want. And of course, you'll find all of our social media links on our website, but also you can do those directly. You want to sign up for those or follow us in those various places. On Facebook, there's a page devoted to us. You'll find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. And on Twitter, you will find us at Good Seats Still. Let us see. What else? Jerry Payne, you know him. You love him. You can't live without him. I can't live without him, at least. He's the good purveyor of production services for this here little show. Jerry Payne Audio Excellence is his little domiciled business there, and we appreciate his continued goodness in putting our collective audio pieces together each and every week. So we tip, again, our baseball cap in his general direction as well. And what else? I think that's it. Yeah, I think that's it. We appreciate, of course, you're listening to us not only this week, but all the weeks in the past and hopefully in the future. Again, please do what it is that you need to do to stay safe and healthy. There's lots of conflicting information out there. Think about all of it. Do the right things. Don't be stupid. And let us all try to get through all of the next number of months and frankly, even beyond together. Do the smart things, will you? And please stay safe and keep others around you similarly safe and healthy. All right, before we run, we're going to leave you with, it is not lost on us that a lot of what we talked about this week with Jim does overlap and what's the word I'm looking for? Is concentric. Yeah, there you go. With a lot of the topics and the stories and the background around a very popular show that was on HBO. I think you can actually get episodes of that for free now for a short period of time as HBO allows people to sample their streaming service in these days of coronavirus and being homebound. It's called Boardwalk Empire, of course. And let us leave you now with that theme, the opening theme of that show. it maybe puts us in a mood and perhaps even convinces you to learn about the baseball components of that show. And we appreciate, of course, your listening. And let's leave you with that theme. And until next week, take care, truly, everybody. And we'll see you soon.